Okay, let's talk big stitch hand binding. There's a few supplies that you need to get started. The first is needles. My favorite needles are milliner's needles, the ones I like to use for hand quilting and hand binding. I like them because the eye of the needle is smaller, so you're not getting that bulky spot where your thread and your needles are together when you're trying to pull all that through the layers. Another good option are embroidery needles. They have a slightly bigger eye, so a little bit easier to thread. However, because the eye is a little bit bigger, you are having a little bit more bulk to your needle and thread. But they're both good options. If you're not quite sure what you think you'd like, it's always a good idea to get something like this, which is a variety pack. That way you can try a whole bunch of different needles and see which one works for you. You're also going to use some thread. 8-weight and 12-weight threads are the most popular for big stitch hand binding. My favorite is Aurifil. It comes in 12-weight. It comes in tons of colors, and it's nice and strong. It doesn't shred on me, and the spools last forever. So this is my favorite. You can also use pearl cotton. Pearl cotton also comes in a variety of colors. It comes in 8-weight and 12-weight. 8-weight is a little bit thicker, so this is 12-weight here, this is 8-weight, and those are also a nice option for hand binding. There's a variety of different manufacturers and different types. You can go ahead and try which ones you want and see what you like. Something else that some people like to use is cotton crochet thread. This can also be used for hand quilting and hand binding. So you've got your needle, you got your thread, and then the last things that we need are some scissors. I have this little pair that I really like because they have a cover that I can take them with me and I don't have to worry about hurting myself if I'm digging into my bag. And a thimble. You need a thimble. I resisted for a long time thimbles. I didn't quite know how to use them and I would get frustrated. There's a lot of different types out on the market, and those are one of the things, again, that's personal preference. Definitely try a couple thimbles, see what you like. They have some like this that have a metal spot in the middle where you're supposed to use to push the needle through. I actually use my middle finger on my right hand, which is where I hold the needle, and the middle finger, and I push the needle through with the side of my finger. So because of that, my favorite are these all leather thimbles. I can put it on my finger and then I can use it to push that needle through using the side of my finger. If you don't have any needles, if you don't have any thimbles and you want to get started right away, I recommend just grabbing a couple band-aids, wrap those around your finger. It's just going to keep your finger from getting too sore because that needle's pushing into it. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to want to cut our thread to the size that we need. A lot of people will say that they cut their thread about 18 inches. For hand quilting, I cut about twice that. So one thing to note is that when you're pulling all through the layers, you never want your thread to be longer than your arm length. That means that you would have to come back and pull a second time, which will really slow you down. So I would recommend cutting a length that feels comfortable for you. If you wanted to start with something a little smaller earlier, when you're getting started, it's a little less wieldy. You don't feel like you're going to maybe get it as tangled. So that's something that you can try. And then maybe you want to try a little bit longer sometime. That's fine too. I'm going to go ahead and put a knot at the end of my thread. I just do a normal knot. Kind of looks like a pretzel. And pull. I like to double knot my thread. And now we're ready to hand bind. So I'm going to go ahead and move the camera down so you can see what I'm doing. Usually when I'm hand binding, I like to start maybe in the middle of a row of my quilt, but because I want to show you how to turn the corner, we're going to start near the edge. To prep your quilt for hand binding, you want to sew your binding to the front of your quilt top with your machine. You want to press that flat and open, and you're going to want to fold it back. I like to use binder clips, these guys, to hold all of my layers in place. You can get some specialty sewing clips that do the same thing. I just find that these binder clips work really well for my purposes, so that's what I end up using. This is binding that was cut at 2.5 inches. You can use binding that's cut at 2.5 inches or 2.25 inches. I tend to prefer 2.5 inches when hand binding. It gives me a little bit more room on the back to work with while having the same look on the front as 2.25 would. So again, that's a little bit personal preference. If you are just starting out, I might recommend you try 2.5 inches. And if down the road you feel like you don't like having as much binding showing on the back, you can definitely cut your strips at 2.25 inches. To get started, we're going to want to take our needle. We've already threaded it. We've got a knot on the end. And we're going to want to put it through the backing. I like to start it right after where I stitched the binding to the backing. So right under that stitching line, I'm going to stick my needle in, and I'm going to travel through the layers. So my needle is not showing up on the front of my quilt, and it's not showing up on the back of my quilt. My needle is through all of those layers, and I'm going to pull my needle through. So now I have about 1.5 inches of space where I have secured that needle. I don't bother pulling my knot through all the layers because my binding is going to cover that up. So that makes it a little bit easier if you've been a little bit nervous about pulling that knot through all the layers. You don't have to for big stitch hand binding. Wherever my thread came out is where I'm going to want to pull it through to the front of my binding. So I'm going to select a spot about 1/8 of an inch from the edge and pull up. Now my binding is ready to be stitched down. I've got my thread in place. You can't see anything from the front. That's how we like it. And we're ready to go. I'm going to take my needle. I hold my needle with my thumb and pointer finger. And then this middle finger I was talking about, it pushes through all the layers. You'll see it rests right on that thimble, the side of the thimble. So that's how my needle gets held. That's what works for me. I always preach personal preference. Try it different ways and see what works for you. We're going to put our needle down whatever length we want our stitch to be. I'm going to use my left hand as a way to help pull and guide that fabric. I'm going to go down and I'm going to come back up. What I want to do is I want to catch those 2 layers of my binding and my backing, and it's okay if I catch some of my batting, that doesn't matter, but we don't want the needle to come through to the front. So you can't see my needle here, which is good, but it's nice and secure here. It's pulling all those other layers. And we're going to go ahead and pull, and we've got a stitch. Once you feel comfortable doing 1 stitch, it can be fun to put 2 or 3 stitches on your needle. It helps speed things along. So I'm going to put 3. 1, 2, I'm going through all those layers. 3, using that left hand to help guide that fabric. You'll notice my left does a lot of this motion. It's pulling the fabric down and up. I'm using it as a way to guide and get that stitch length that I want. I'm going to check the front. I can't see any of my needle. That means it's not going through the front, which is good. I'm going to go ahead and pull. Periodically, you don't have to do this after every stitch, but it's a good idea to check it out once in a while. You want to fold back the edge of your binding and make sure that you're catching that backing in your stitches. This usually happens to be an issue wherever you joined 2 binding strips together. You have a little bit of that bulk from having extra layers, and it can be a spot where you don't catch your backing. So that's a good place to just check. You want to make sure that you're catching all those layers, backing, and both layers of the binding fabric, because that's how you'll make sure that your binding is secure. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do a couple more stitches. So I'm going down, I'm going to come back up. Again, not coming through to the front, but I'm catching that backing and the binding, down, up, using my left hand to guide the fabric, and pull. Oh, I caught a little knot. That's okay. I don't use any thread gloss. I find that with this Orifle thread I don't need to. It goes through all the layers nice and smooth, but you can definitely add some thread gloss or thread conditioner if you feel like you are getting some tangles or it's not pulling through all the layers like you would want it to. Checking the front, checking the back, underneath, we're good. And we're coming up on that corner. There's a couple ways we can turn the corner. I'm going to go ahead and take that binding clip that I had on the edge and I'm going to move it to the side. I still want it to hold my nice mitered corner together, but I just need it out of my way a little bit. I've got a thread here from when I attached the binding. I'm just going to go ahead and snip that right away. That way it's not in my way a little bit later. Our goal is to get close to this corner as possible. Where that fold on the mitered corner is, that's as close as we want to get, and then we're able to decide what kind of corners we want to put on this particular quilt. So I'm going to keep doing my little binding stitches, down and up, down and up. Thread wants to tangle on me today. It wasn't doing that earlier. There we go. Okay, so this is about as close as we're gonna get. If I did one more stitch, I would be into that fold on the mitered corner, which if I wanted to not do anything fancy on the corners, I just want to get to my corner, turn it, and go the other way. What I would want to do is I would want to put my needle down on that fold, catch all those layers, and I'd be able to come up on the other side and start binding this way. What I want to do instead is I want to do some fancy corners. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put my needle down through those layers, and I'm going to show you if you wanted to put a stitch, one stitch up here. You go down through the layers and up about midway on your binding corner. Okay, I'm right about there. And then I'm going to go down right across from it, come back up where my thread originally is. So I'm basically doing like a little loop. So you can see that corner starting to take shape. To finish it, to get back to being able to stitch on the other side, I'm going to go right back down here. So you're essentially doing 2 loops on the front of your quilt, or on the back of your quilt, I should say, on your back, on your binding. I'm going to go down through all those layers, and I would come back up right here so I'm able to start stitching the other way. What I want to do though is I want to do an X. So I'm going to show you that one. That's the third way that you can do a fun little corner. I'm going to just gently take out our little stitch. I'm going to go back to before I got to that corner. There we go. Okay. Again, I'm going to go down into the corner of the mitered corner, right where that fold is. I'm going down here, so I'm tacking all those layers down and getting them nice and secure. This time, instead of coming up right in the middle like we did for the stitch, I'm going to go near the top, still on one side of that fold. I'm going to go down diagonally to however big I want my X to be, and I'm going to come back up next to where my thread currently is. You can see that X starting to take shape. So now I need to finish my X, so where this bottom part of my X is, I'm going to go next to it, which is going to create that diagonal stitch with my thread. And I'm going to travel through the layers and come up right about there. So now I'm ready to start stitching on that next side. There we go. Rotate my quilt so that you can still see what I'm doing. And now I'm going to go back to doing those regular stitches through all the layers, not coming through the front, down and up, down and up, checking that I am not coming through the front of my quilt top, getting out my binding clips when I get close to them, and pulling all of those through. Now I want to show you what you're going to do when you get to the end of your thread. Okay, so we're going to say that I am coming to the end of my thread. When I have about 6 inches of thread left, it's time to start thinking about ending this piece of thread and starting a new one. You don't want to wait till you don't have enough thread left. It can be a little bit tricky if you don't leave yourself enough room. So always better to have a little bit more thread left over than not enough. We're going to go through our binding. We're going to travel through that backing layer in between our backing and our front, like we did when we first started binding. That first time when we added our thread the first time, making sure we're not coming through that top. We have traveled through the layers. Okay, so my last stitch is here, my thread is right here, and that's the way we want it, about an inch to an inch and a half away. And now I'm going to add a couple knots where my thread is. The reason that we travel a little bit before knotting off our thread is because if we try to knot our thread too close to that last stitch, you're going to end up with either a knot that is too close to the stitch where you've got some puckering, too far away from the stitch where your thread tension now is super loose. By bringing that thread just a little bit further away, because we've got the ability to open up our binding and be able to get at that thread, we're able to have a nicer knot and a nicer thread tension. Okay, so I've done 2 knots. I'm going to go ahead and cut my thread. I like to leave a little tail. You don't have to. Again, we're not going to bury our knots because we are just keeping it through all of the layers. It's going to get buried through our binding, which is going to cover it up. So we don't have to worry about pulling that knot into our banding layers. I am going to get my next thread ready to go. And again, we're going to do a couple knots at the end. They don't need to be right next to the end. They can be a couple inches away. I like to do 2 knots. And just how we started with that first one initially, we're going to want to put our needle in, travel through the layers a little bit, and this time we want to come up right near where that last stitch is. We already have a knot here from when we knotted off this thread. So we want to make sure that we are not putting our second knot right next to it. It's going to add a little bit of a bulky spot if you do, and you will feel it when all is said and done. So I'm going to choose to go a little further away, about ½ inch. I'm going to put my needle in, and I'm going to travel through those layers between the backing and the front in that batting, and I'm going to come up close to where that last stitch is. It's not perfect, and that's okay. We don't need it to be perfect. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring that needle up through the binding where I want to start my next stitch, which is going to be right about here. That's where I want to start. Give a nice little pull. Now my thread is ready to go. I have taken those little ends and I've tucked them into my binding, folded my binding over it, and I'm ready to stitch. Again, we're going down and up using our left hand, or if you are left hand dominant, then using your right hand, whichever hand is not holding the needle, to help manipulate the fabric and those layers. There we are. The last thing I want to cover is what to do when you've gone all the way around your quilt and you've gotten back to where you started. So ending this thread is a little bit different than ending the other ones because we don't want to leave a gap between our last stitch and our first stitch. We want that to be a very seamless transition. So this is going to be a little bit different than we've done for the other times we've ended and started our threads. Just gonna give myself a little bit of thread. We're gonna pretend we made it through all the sides, and we're coming back to that front beat, that first stitch we did. And we are going to finish it off. Okay, so I'm gonna start about right here. I'm gonna lead myself to that spot. You would be coming with your thread down the side of the quilt, so most likely you're not starting a new thread this close to the end, but you might be. Depends how things shake up. Knot from when I started. I'm going to make sure that the little tail gets tucked in there. I'm going to be stitching all the way to where I started. You'll notice I'm about an inch away now, and this is where I start thinking and planning my stitches. I try not to end up with a really little itty bitty stitch or a really big stitch. Sometimes it's unavoidable and it's really not the end of the world. But when I'm about an inch away, I start thinking and planning how to get those stitches a little bit even. Maybe I make them all slightly smaller. Oh, you see there, I would get too close. So, nope, I'm just gonna make this one then slightly bigger, have one less stitch, and then maybe that'll get me there. Yep, right about there. Okay, so I just need to go down and then I would have finished. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take our needle, we're gonna go down through the binding, but not through the backing. We want it to just poke right back out. So that stitch is complete on our stitching, and now we need to do something with our thread. What we're gonna do is we're gonna tie a knot. We don't wanna tie our knot all the way to the edge, so close to that stitch. We actually want it to be about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch away. Whoa, that'll be too far. Hold on. Apparently, if you talk and you stitch at the same time. Okay, whew. Let me put my needle through there. So, what we want it to be is about right there. You'll notice that it's about 1/4 of an inch away from here. So here is where we came back out with our binding, and our knot is right about here. So about 1/4 of an inch away. Again, I like to do 2 knots. You can choose to do 1 knot. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to take our needle, we're going to go through the layers, we're going to go in between our binding and our backing. So we're not poking through that backing yet, we just want to go in between the layers. Then you're going to want to feel for that backing fabric, and you want to go through the backing fabric. Again, you're not coming through the front. If you notice you go through the front, just simply pull it out gently and try again. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to actually want to poke back out through your binding. So your needle is going to be in the middle of your binding, and that's okay. As long as you've gone through the backing traveled a little bit, and now you come up through the binding. What we're going to do is we're going to pull our thread gently, and then we're going to pull that knot through that backing. That's why it's important to go through the backing. We're going to be able to bury this one knot. Burying this knot helps because we didn't put a knot right next to the stitch, so burying it gets it secured and through the layers of batting, and it's not going to go anywhere. We are going to cut our thread, and there you are. Big Stitch hand binding. All of the supplies that I've talked about are available in my Amazon shop, and I'm going to link to it in the comments section below. So if you are looking for any of these pieces that I recommend, the thread, the thimble, you can find all of those in my shop. And anything that you want to see, I've got a photo tutorial about this on my blog. I'll link to that below, as well as some variations on Big Stitch hand binding that's on the blog as well, and that's also in the link below. Thanks for watching.